Welcome to Keith Hershift's Midnight Cartoon Program.
Welcome to episode 5. Tonight we'll be covering detail. The important thing to remember with detail is the more work you do in the structural stages, and prior to that, the gesture stage, getting the pose correct, getting the construction of the character correct, the more believable your details will be. They give you a framework to base all of your choices off of. So if you haven't watched those videos, go back. They're the last couple videos that I posted. Watch those. One of the key traits of detail is they can tell a story. They can add to the story you're telling. The choices you make when you're creating a character and you're creating the costume of the character, you can add hints of who they are and allude to their history, what they've been through, and the choices that they make. We all make certain choices in our style of clothing and dress that give us a sense of individuality. And your characters are no different. The more thought you put into the details of your character, the more original and genuine and believable your characters will be. As we move into this stage, consider things like texture. They'll help you figure out what kind of details you're working with. Every object has a different texture, and they all require different handling. So observe from real life and commit things to memory, and slowly build up your vocabulary, your vocabulary of things that you can pull from to put into your art. Also think about the silhouette that you're creating. As you're adding details, you're also changing the silhouette of your character. You can use this to create more visual interest and make your drawing a bit more complex. And that goes into shape design and all that stuff. So think about how you're collecting and grouping the details that you do add. You don't want them to be scattered all over the place. You want them to be thoughtfully placed. And also remember, different styles require different levels of detail. So if you're doing something extremely cartooned, like the old Garfield cartoons, they made their details extremely broad and simplified. If you're doing something like video game design, you're going to have to probably add a lot more minuscule details to give the character the believability in the world that they exist in. But experiment with different styles, experiment with different techniques. If you see something that you like that works, pull it in and use it. Today we are focusing on detail because apparently the censor is here and we don't get along, and he thinks that the gesture drawings that we did a couple weeks ago were too close to nudity, so everyone's going to be clothed in these videos to appease the prudes. Yeah. Think you're real tough. Think you're real tough with your knife. We'll see how this plays out. But while I deal with that, why don't you watch some cartoons?
So as we move into the detail stage, you want to remember the previous step of laying in the information about the surface. The surface planes, how they curve, and those shapes. So when you add in details, they curve along those same planes. And it goes for whatever texture you're using. If it's like square access panels or like a fur texture, If they're raised, you're casting shadows along those same planes. So think about how the surface is moving in three-dimensional space. If you were to cut into the shape like this, you'd see cast shadows on the inside area where the light wouldn't be able to penetrate, and text, and details like that would wrap along it too. If you were to take like a cube shape, like this one, and add details on it, I like to group the details together. It makes it seem more organized, and when you add other details, wrap them around, and start considering, like shadow. Also, when you cut into an object, it kind of suggests that there's an inner working to it, and lay all your marks along the plane in perspective. So think about the shapes as though they're receding into space or turning. So if I was to draw a character like this guy, he's just sort of a big ogre-ish character. When I start adding details, think of things that look interesting, like spikes. They create an interesting negative space, and also texture. If he's like an outdoor kind of character, he's probably got pelts hanging off him, that sort of thing. If you had like gauntlets and things like that, make sure they wrap around the form. Make sure they wrap around the forearm, and add details in that kind of tell a story about him. On the forearm there, I gave him like a skull, so he's not the nicest guy. If you give him like a helmet, if you're looking up, the line curves up. Also think about details like on the helmet. I broke one of the horns off of him. Kind of suggests he's been through some combat. Remember to use your details to tell a story. So on this next one, I'll just do a quick sketch of a figure and add some details onto him. This guy's going to be, some sort of astronaut, and I'm just making up the details as I go along. So think about the space that the head would take up inside of it. Make sure, when you're building the costume and the details, make sure that they can actually accommodate the anatomy that you're giving them. I could have actually made the helmet a little bit taller on this guy, but to have the camera, it's always a weird angle to draw it. And then I always add different details like the antennas and things like that, because I think they create a more interesting silhouette to the shape. And you're thinking about the negative space too, and also remember overlap. You're trying to push the idea that objects are in front of other objects. And as you do those, you're also carving into the, as I mentioned, negative space. So that's the space that surrounds the character, and it helps tell the story a bit. Put it around the hands and things like that, and you can really tell just from the silhouette what the character's doing. One of the hard details to do is glasses. I usually like to, first off, think about it in perspective. The further one is going to be a bit smaller, like they recede into space. And, and then I just go back and forth, and I put a detail on the left, put a detail on the right, and I try to keep it even and slowly build up. Also, use reference, take a look at them, see where they actually land on the face. But as you're adding details like the hat, make sure the inside brim and the band around the top, make sure they feel like they're actually wrapping around the head and taking up physical space. Move on to the this week's demo drawing. I'll be composing a scene using one of my characters from the comic. When I start figuring out like the layout of a scene, I usually just start blocking in areas, get something that looks cool, and then I go back in while everything's real light and loose, and I'll use the horizon line, vanishing points to kind of nail down the perspective a little bit. And also think about detail in terms of backgrounds too. So you don't just draw like a flat wall. Think about the vents, the ductwork going through it. It adds a little bit more visual interest into the image. And again, throughout all the steps here, I'm doing the exact same thing I did when I was working on just a character. You start loose, you lay in the overall shape, and then you go back in, you tighten up, and you refine it in later passes. You'll notice here I'm not using a ruler for any of my perspective or backgrounds. I like the look it gives, and I find that I spend a lot more time working on a background when I actually enjoy the process of it. So there's nothing wrong with using rulers. I just don't like how my backgrounds come out when I use one. So I've found some little tricks, and I've practiced being able to pull a fairly straight line. And then the nice thing that really helps is when I'm coloring a lot of these, and I'm doing digital color or something like that, I can use texture also to separate the backgrounds from the foregrounds. If everything has kind of like a wavy line to it, you do run the risk of potentially having everything just sort of blend together, and you don't have as strong of a contrast between the organic shapes of the character and the hard edges of a ruled background. But I like that loose sketchiness. I see it a lot more in European cartoons or European comics. But just keep adding details, scratches, things like that. Make your environments feel lived in.
Well, that's all for tonight's episode. Keep in mind that the detail is another component of style, and it takes sometimes years or even longer to figure out that right balance that works for you and your artwork. Remember, all the things that I say in these videos are what I found works for me, and I'm trying to explain something that is an unconscious process at this point for me. So if you find something that works for you, try it out. If you can find a way to add really complex detail and you work completely from reference and you're happy with the result, go for it. Simplifying forms can also be a really useful tool, and even if you don't use it for your finished work, it's not a bad exercise. It can make you realize things about the way that you approach a drawing, and you can pull, kind of pick and choose, which elements you use. So before I go, don't forget, I have a comic out. I'll put a link in the description if you want to go and check that out. I also put out a digital version of it. It's a bit cheaper, and it's instant gratification. Don't forget to like and subscribe and all that stuff. If you have any comments or questions, make sure to leave them in the comments section below. I would love to hear from you, and if you have a question, I can always try and answer it in one of the next videos. And I want to thank the censor for showing up today. You really made us, you really helped us make a great episode. And I wanted to give you something to just send you off with. Cue cards? Yeah, that's right. Gratuitous nudity. Yeah, how do you like that? How do you like that stuff that just happened? I don't think so, buddy. I'm in control of the show now. We're taking it back. See you next week.